So knowing that this present civilization wouldn't be salvageable in its form just based on natural cycles, the liquidation process begins to keep some wealth and extract some resources for the continuity of government. So if you delude yourself and think this whole thing in Europe of shutting down all the smelters and everything metal across the base metals to just shut it down and lock everything in warehouses, if you think that is because of power prices, the power prices are deployed to get all that supply locked in place for delivery, not for your hands, for theirs to reset the new society. And welcome back for the second hour of mini Ice Age conversations. I'm right here with Ransom Godwin, 420 TV Freedomist Films. Talking about how new grow zones may be set up. And is this really a reset that has gone on many times before? Where the history has changed after the reset? Because I'm still of the volition that as the electromagnetic fields shift going into 2024, when we get that second toroid looping magnetic field between the outer solar system and our sun, with the Earth in the middle, I really believe there's going to be something strange happen with the crust. There's going to be a lot of pulling, rifting, shifting, things that bridges, for example, railroads, conduits, pipelines, water pipelines. You've seen a lot of water pipeline breaks these days. Those are the kind of things that will be affected in the top, 1 mile of the crust or so with this new looping field. Things might squeeze out like toothpaste across the surface of the Earth, anywhere from 3 to 10 to 15 feet deep in some places, which would bury, imagine a 100 square mile area that, something oozed out of the Earth, and by the time it solidified and reached the outer areas, it was only 3 feet deep, but right where it oozed out of the Earth, it was 15 feet deep, and it buried buildings. Ransom, before the break, you talked about, what if there was a previous civilization at the Younger Dryas impact? There had to have been. They were coming out of the Ice Age for, 5,000 years they were coming out of the Ice Age. From the really, really, really cold period, breaking out of that, again, what causes a shift out of the Ice Age into this warming period we experience right now? And what shifts us back into? It's got to be electric. Electromagnetic for sure. But you need the magnetism to take the electric currents. They're intertwined, literally, field-aligned currents. What do you think that society, where would it have stemmed from? Because you got to think there was a previous interglacial about 118,000 years ago. So the exact same conditions that we experience right now were experienced 100,000 years ago. So think about our civilization, how far we've supposedly come, quote unquote, in the history that's been given to us from 3000 BC or even the year 0 to the last 2,000 years up until today. That's a lot of accomplishment in 2,000 years. Now, they literally had the same brains, same bodies. You never would have known they were any different other than, no, you wouldn't have. They're exactly the same as we were. Had 10,000 years of warmth, 110, 118,000 years ago. Let's put it in that range. If something were to survive that, if something happens now, our civilizations are going to be pockets of people who live through it, and they're going to bring something back up again, some sort of civilization out of the ashes, if you will, as the Earth slips back into an ice age again. That's the same society I say survived from the last ice age interglacial that came all the way to where it was coming out of the ice age, and then boom, that cometary impact right there on the ice sheet. See, that was something that probably didn't happen during the last ice age or the previous two, that they were able to carry some sort of civilization from one ice age interglacial to the next. Russia, China, and India are saying goodbye to the U.S. dollar as Biden is paying off student loans and printing more money. Some say the new reserve currency called BRICS should be backed by gold. Patriot Gold Group has a no-fee-for-life IRA or 401k that can be in physical gold or silver. And you may be eligible for the no-fee-for-life IRA on qualifying rollovers. Patriot Gold Group, Consumer Affairs top-rated gold IRA dealer 6 years in a row. Call 1-800-356-4470. And now on with the video. The 90,000 years in ice, they were still there. They just shifted. They more, if they were down near the equator, they were further, whatever. But this society still exists and just moves through, whether there is an ice age or not. Population is going to be different, but the same society you're referencing at that Younger Dryas, which disappeared, and then what? how did they disappear all their history artifacts and megaliths. I think in our modern society, a megalith would be an under-highway support structure, like one of those gigantic concrete things that's holding up the highways, like an 8-lane highway in California or something. If those were to collapse down and 12,000 years later, you would find those. And what do you think, Ransom? Like, what would they really find from our civilization? We talked about this before, but could the history be erased so cleanly? You know, a global liquefaction event like we're going to see here coming up 2024-25 with magnetic field alignments. I mean, could you erase the entire history of humanity in less than 400 years and reset it every single time? I mean, is that even possible in 400 years and put a whole new history and leave some of the stuff that fits the narrative just in place to be found? Or have your bought and paid for archaeologists find it and then put out what they were told to put out in their timelines? Compared to what you're finding, which is way different.
The cycles keep getting smaller every time they reset. So something like 12,000 years, 5,000 years, 2,000 years. But each time they seem, like you said, they can't wipe it totally clean. Now, something happened, I'm saying 12,000 years ago, where they had advanced technology that seems to be a little bit further than what we're allowed to have right now. But let's put that aside for a minute and talk about how long would it really take to erase a society. And when we left off on the break, you were talking about not only the colonization of North Africa and, you know, different places by Europeaners, but it was going back and forth for several thousand years. So this has been happening, and human beings won't face the fact that the way that the earth works and the amount of changes that it goes through in cycles, that human beings cannot survive on earth by staying stationary. Throughout all of history, there's been human migration that's had to move because of climate change, because of droughts, because of whatever, famine, etc. But now you come into a time where it's more engineered, and this is the kind of circles back to when they're resetting this time. It's got an agenda that's different than the last several times. And this goes off into some pretty sinister things, because you think about when the population in 20 years is different, most of those people do not own deeds or hold land because they're not from those countries. So unless they bought it recently, they probably have a mortgage or a deal with the bank or whatever. And that's the one thing that's going to remain in Europe is the central banks. But meanwhile, most of the properties are going to transfer over to the banks from families that have had these farms and these houses. And then when they have no children to take the land, of course, it's going to go back into the hands of the banks, which are going to resell all of this land to the new population. So they're making money hand over fist, except for there's only one problem going to be in Europe, is that you're going to have this idea of balkanization, which is so many different kinds of people that don't want to change to a new culture that are in the same areas. You're going to have circumstances like we had in the breakaways. You know, they're going to have these clashes of what's left of the youth that are still in the countries. And then guess what's going to happen? It happens on a small scale as those remaining European families are going to move. They're going to move out. They're going to sell their land, which changes the total population. And then the voting changes, the culture changes. And then you get back to what I was talking about, that they start eradicating books, historical stuff, to where the old world, the old empires are totally reset and destroyed. And they start these new places. This has happened, I don't know how many times. And you can think about it on a small scale, like the American city. They call it gentrification now, is what they call it. So basically you had white neighborhoods that had new houses and stuff in the 40s and 50s. And you had black neighborhoods that had nice houses, and they had their own booming economy that started going good. And they had nuclear families and things like that. But then all of a sudden they offered welfare, and the nuclear family has been breaking down since Lyndon Johnson introduced basically welfare to the country. And then they took away the jobs. Manufacturing stopped. So the people that still had a little bit of money moved out of those cities. The ghettos became bigger. And then later, all the property values dropped to nothing. Nobody owns anything. And then eventually in time, people start coming back because they're buying up all the land that's now cheap, because it's been destroyed and then brought back up. You could see that the banks are the constant, the money printers, the money manipulators. And you would imagine that each time that the world has reset, those are the same people. You can call them what you want, the elite, the royalty. It's the people who have the gold because contrary to popular belief, I know there's a golden rule that comes out of the Bible to treat others how you would like to be treated. The real golden rule that runs this world is he who has the gold makes the rules. And it's so funny that I was just put out a documentary that was talking about how much gold they were finding in the Grand Canyon, and the banks were panicking that the price of gold would go down to nothing. And this was around the same time as they created, the creature from Jekyll Island, and we went into the central banking system. Now, the gold market might have quit, but what's funny is there's a new phenomenon. I don't know if you saw that, but up in Iceland, one of the volcanoes, they're just spewed out pure gold, which is like a never seen before phenomenon. So that tells you like what's going on in the earth, where one of these usually veins of gold that would fall down to the bottom when the water and whatever happens because it's a heavier element goes down to the bottom. What's going on inside the earth when it's spewing out, chunks of pure gold out of some streak of gold or vein of gold that's under the earth? You were talking a lot about the top of the crust shifting, and you seeing that in a real way, like people's water and electricity and things like that being cut off. It seems like the government is preparing everybody for these ideas. Look down in Mississippi.
Yeah, every town sees that. It seems to be on like a 50 or 60-year cycle. Well, those old factory districts, nobody wanted to buy that land down there. It might have been, pollution, what we're finally understanding more about toxic chemicals, it was used for this, that, and the other. It was warehouses. It was a railroad depot. The train doesn't come anymore. It was an old factory. There's a cool smokestack, whatever. Oh, now those are like art gallery museum areas. Before it was a high crime area. Like you say, if you follow that same timeline, then say 1940s and 50s, and then it becomes really depressed value in the 70s. And then it smolders there until the mid 80s or, mid 90s. People pick it up a little more. And then suddenly in these last, 20 years, they're like, oh, it's a cool place. Let's turn this factory. Look at the large door. It's cool artwork, whatever. It seems to be a good 60. So over there, 46, now even longer. Hey, you know what? It's like an 80-year cycle. It's right on exactly sitting the 80-year cycles of boom and bust. That's exactly what it is. You hit that on the head. 80-year cycle. That, what you're talking about, gentrification cycle, is the fourth turning. Because it goes through all those cycles of, yep, that's it. So the gentrification cycle sits on top and rides on top of that. Klaus and Strauss, the fourth turning. So then you have to ask yourself, what other cycles are within that? Are there larger cycles of 400 years? So 5 of these turnings, or 5 reemergences of what was poor areas turn into gentrified areas, back and forth, where, because right now we're going to be dropping off the economy. So these areas around what we're seeing now is going to drop off into dismal, people are going to move out. You couldn't pay to stay there. You wouldn't. So these areas are going to go into that decay stage right now, but think about somebody in 40 or 50 years from now will start picking those up. We'll remember it as the crash, areas abandoned, because what we consider now factory zones are put where? They're not in the same downtown area where the factory zones were 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right along the river. Our new factory zones are way out in the country. So imagine in 60 years from now, they'll be like, whoa, it's way out in the sort of suburby in the country. Oh, there's a factory. It's a new art gallery. But it'll be more out into the suburbs in a country setting versus right downtown. It'll shift a little. But the same metrics will be employed through the media to get you to go there, spend your money there. One thing way back when you were talking, when you started talking about Pakistan and the floods back in the beginning of the first hour, I've been looking at the satellite photos of the before and the after on the size of the flooding in Pakistan. It's massive. It truly is massive, unbelievably massive. But when you look at a wider view of what's reflooding, there were incredibly vast drainage deltas from an entire continent coming out of there. It's been dry for, 4,000 years going on, the last 1,000 years for sure, completely dry. That's Harappa Valley. That was a cradle of civilization 6,000 years ago. So back then, it was milk and honey forests, plains full of game, abundant fresh water, flowing everywhere. Has to be the perfect climate for a cradle of civilization, because then they have the free time because all their basic needs for food and shelter are met, so then they can go contemplate. Cradle of civilization, so is Mesopotamia. And now it's a desert. But when you look at these satellite photos where the water is refilling, you can actually see the contours of it flowing out through like a massive delta. Okavango Delta. Forget the Kalahari canals and that sort of thing that lead into the Okavango Delta. That would never have been a previous civilization that set out equally spaced 75 foot apart canals that harvest the water from the Okavango Delta and flow out and allow you to natural agriculture from the drainage of the Okavango Delta. You would never have that ability of a society, say 6,000. Oh, wait a minute. That's exactly when those were supposedly built. So how much of this history has disappeared? We're watching this place reliquefy. That's the new pattern that's shifting over there. You should have seen the floods in Iran last year and the year before. They had areas that turn into inland seas. But today we would know as like estuaries leading out into the sea. So what we're seeing is a full continental shift happening in real time right now with cloud cells, jet streams, and new cloud building layers shifting along with the magnetic field changes, allowing all of this to move into different places. Where it's moving to and its final extent of movement has already been mapped out. So whoever's controlling this show already understands exactly where it's going to move to, how far we are into the movement. Is it another 3 degrees north latitude that it moves? Is it another 10 degrees, another 16 degrees, another 32 degrees? Who knows? But it's going to eventually get to that maximum movement point. And somebody, I guarantee you, somebody already knows exactly the latitude band that it will cease moving forward. And they've already mapped this out through, I'm going to say, millions of years, if not hundreds of thousands on the low end. These same societies have been here and ridden out all these ice ages in the interglacials. Some societies rebuild from the last interglacial, bring through, and just is starting to come out like Ransom was speaking about what got wiped out, what civilization at the Younger Dryas impact on the ice sheet. But 5,000 years prior to that, they were coming out of an ice age, and 5,000 years into the warming, before that unusual event of a comet hitting the ice sheet in Canada, which creates the Carolina Bays. And they always have, if you look at the Carolina Bays, all those impactors are in the exact same angle and degree of latitude. And they never could find the impactors. It was ice. It hit and then it melted. These same societies are still here, because if things would have gotten completely wiped out at the Younger Dryas boundary era of an ice sheet cometary impact, we wouldn't be here with 8 billion people. So you got to think, if we went from a cometary impact 12,500 years ago, this is like global temperatures dropped 20 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed that way. The cloud layer enveloped the planet, but it finally dissipated. They said humanity got squeezed down to 10 million what would consider breeding pairs. 10 million couples that could have children were the only thing left after that cometary impact. But here we are today, 8 billion people. So you got to think in interglacials, 90,000 years. 8 of those cycles could be wiped all the way back to like 5 million breeding pairs and then back up again, back down, back up, back down. It's a heartbeat, a breath. So it doesn't matter if you go from 8 billion down to even 20, 30, 100 million. It doesn't matter. You know, think about it as an off-planet species looking at the human race as nothing more than a vibratory creature to control to get emanating energies off of the being. Forget the physical flesh. You want to affect the mind so it vibrates at a certain frequency. That frequency comes off and it's food or harvestable for another species. That's what it's looked at. So it doesn't matter. The earth will just keep rebounding. So who cares? See, that's the way I'm starting to look at these things is, and we're in this contraction period. It's meant to put off a vibration for some entity to feed off of. It's almost like the earth's being harvested, liquidated, and everything is getting ready for the petri dish to be cleansed and started over. But I'm wondering, you know, this juncture of reset, not in a nefarious way, although it is, for not warning the people. The 400-year cycle, knowing that it's going to impact exactly these years and start these years, there would be famines anyway. So knowing that this present civilization wouldn't be salvageable in its form just based on natural cycles. The liquidation process begins to keep some wealth and extract some resources for the continuity of government. So if you delude yourself and think this whole thing in Europe of shutting down all the smelters and everything metal across the base metals to just shut it down and lock everything in warehouses, if you think that is because of power prices, the power prices are deployed to get all that supply locked in place for delivery, not for your hands, for theirs to reset the new society. And you could play this game again and again and again every 400 years. Because even some of the older stories, I mean, you look at the Dutch East Indias Company. It's very much like Amazon. You know, if there were other devices for power or movement or capturing winds in a vortice form, you could make things move and spin faster. So perhaps the trade that we consider was 4 months really wasn't 4 months, and that was a story given to us. But you got to think about the same exact things are in play, whether they're super slow by going from ship 4 months over across from California to, I don't know, China back in the day. Slow boat to China literally comes from that 4-month journey to go across the Pacific. Or from the British Isles over to the America, which used to take a month. Then there was the trade. Then it's very much the same thing, all the global trade. But at that point of collapse, and you look across the world, or let's say 1600s, what do we really know about the world? We know that the same kings, queens that we're talking about today that just shifted the queen to the king is back in power again. Things are destroyed, antiquity removed. Like you think about a full collapse. Who's going to be going back to the desert to see the Buddha ruins that the ISIS crew blew up in Afghanistan? The 3 largest standing Buddhas that they carved into solid rock. There was a central Buddha, and they were carved out of solid rock, straight in. And on the pilgrimage, people come in and worship there. 2,000 prior, 2,500 years ago. After this collapse here, it's going to be a big one, and it's going to take society back down. Now, see, this is the misnomer. Is it going to take it back down on a regular 400-year cycle reset, which we think was a total collapse since the Roman Empire, or is this just like a regular one and it's just a regular reset? Based on magnetic field changes in the whole cycle of the 400-year cycle. So boom, we collapse. Okay. It's going to take 100 years or so for things to smooth out. And then what you remember, moving forward with the thing of travel to start again, it'll take 100+ years. But there will be explorers at that time finding ruins buried in sand. But is it really 4,000 years ago that these ruins are buried in sand and these blown up, what were carved out of solid rock Buddhas? Oh, there were 3,000 years ago here. Who writes the history? Because you got to think about it. This thing going through, the economy resets. Okay, maybe there's nobody that explores for 250 years from this point. When they get there 250 years from now, after things been sandblasted and no human intervention, that thing might even be covered by forest with the new weather patterns coming in. It might even have grass on what would be considered pyramid hills or tombs or whatnot. It might actually look like grassy knolls when you're walking over burial sites and like different man-made structures. Who knows? Oh, you found one. Oh, great. That's 300 years in the future. Because think about the ancient Egyptian explorers. When do we start to really hear about Egypt? Oh, Napoleon. So if you're using the 1600s date of going back 400 years to the last grand solar minimum, we really start to hear about Egypt as a place of historical. That all came from that French dude traveling around. Perfect timing. It's about 200 years. That's about 200 years, isn't it? Think about Napoleon when he went up and then they started digging around the Sphinx. That was 1800s. But that was 200 to 250 years from the 1600s. So if the same thing were to collapse, could history be hidden enough with new excuses given? Because if you follow the play that they've done so far, is the Smithsonian grabs any of the ancient antiquities, especially giant skeletons, and anything found that doesn't fit in tool and metallurgy and stonework and sculpting that we can't even do it today, even with CNC lathes. It's so off the hook that you would need plasma coming out to melt the stone instead of actually chipping it off. And then you'd have to polish it afterwards with incredible high. I don't even know if you would be using a sanding disc at that point, more ultrasound. That might mimic some sort of scrubbing substance. But that's what you need to do to get to the level of where they find these objects that have been sculpted, which is way above what we can do today. So, that was advanced. It disappears. What you see is what they let you see. In Egyptian Antiquities Museum, that's all they let you see is the same damn mummy you've ever heard of. The Tutankhamun thing, the gold, the mummy sarcophagus. Dude, that's all you get. The exact timeline. So then what are the other institutions? Nature magazine. Oh, they tightly control the peer-reviewed research about ancient history coming out. The digs. History is very sculpted and very curated for us. But I think we're at maybe 200 years is enough to wipe it completely clean. But that nomadic history of the last 7,000 years, and then suddenly, start planting corn and we need to stay in the same place. How many resets have there been? Is that the same story they tell every time we come into the 12,500 year cycle?
It's ironic you talk about the 1800s because, I've been looking into studying Mayan and Aztec history. And for the longest time, it was perpetrated that Teotihuacan was an Aztec city. But it turns out it was just like the Great Pyramid in Egypt, that it was completely covered over. The Aztec barely saw a small portion of the city when they called it the City of the Gods. Now that there's been more dating on it, right about the time that they uncovered megalithic stones, they stopped digging because, that wasn't fitting in with the Aztec narrative of who built the thing. So it now turns out that Teotihuacan is a city built by an unknown empire about 100 years before the first Mayan city was built. They've given it the name Teotihuacanos as the people because they don't know who did it. Now, the Aztec came later. They found small portions of it. They buried some of their artifacts and stuff there. They were really impressed with it, but it kind of makes you wonder, why is it exactly at that same time in 1806 that, an archaeologist finally comes along to Teotihuacan and says, hey, there's a big old giant city here. Let's start digging it out. They dig it out. That's the same time period they're digging out Egypt. And as anybody has actually studied Egyptian history, they'll realize that all of those sarcophaguses and most of the writing on everything, almost all of that is from the Pharaonic people who came along and also found the Great Pyramids. They've been trying to hide that for a long time because they wrote all these Egyptology books. And the hieroglyphs and stuff obviously came later because some of the creations that were made from the Anwar province and some of the artifacts that they find in the later pharaonic tombs, they didn't make, but they came along and they carved it. They didn't even have anything that could polish diorite down to a mirror surface. They didn't have tools that could cut these stones. So we kind of know that they found them. And then their later works are obviously mortar and smaller blocks. They cut the older blocks to make new monuments. We see the keystone cuts and all of these things from not only South America, Central America. You find it in Angkor Wat. You find it all over the places that have megalithic stones. It's this technology that can be identified that had no writing on it on these megalithic sites, no writing whatsoever. However, they did have some unique signatures of their technology, which is strangely shaped trapezoidal pieces and these keystone cuts. And that right there is an indication that they had hardcore metallurgy because they were melting metal to fit into these keystone cuts to keep these giant blocks together, because it seems like at whatever time period they were making that, there was a lot of geologic activity, and they had enough technology to build these superstructures out of megalithic stones that could withstand the shaking of the earth. And now you fast forward. What happened to that? We don't know, but these other civilizations came and they sat on it, and then they went, and their empire failed, and they disappeared. And then we come along with the modern archaeology that obviously does not tell the truth, because one of the key indications that there was something really big to hide is whenever the Smithsonian Institute got involved in archaeology in the Americas, in which they usually shut down everything. They shut down digging. And you notice that this is a worldwide phenomenon where the archaeological digging and research only goes to a certain point, and then they'll just stop, and it'll be decades and decades, almost 50 years before anything new comes out, because they want to sell books. They want to indoctrinate their story. But now we're coming to a time where it's very possible that the grids are going to shut off. And the grid equates to everyone's new cyberpunk life, where they live in these apps, social media. This is where they're getting all their information. And if that just turned off, just a situation ripe for collapse. So we know we're in that time period. It's just a question of how And it seems like the powers that be have been testing the waters in these small beta tests. Turn off the power here, lock down the people there. Evidence is pointing to they are pulling the plug.